The fluorescent lights on the 40th floor of Torres Industries hummed their lonely midnight song as I pushed my mop across marble floors that gleamed like mirrors beneath my tired feet. My earbuds pressed tight against the world outside, filling my head with the familiar melody that Mama used to sing when I was small, before the cancer took her, before everything became so heavy and complicated. I sang along under my breath, my voice cracking on the high notes because exhaustion had settled into my bones like lead after 16 hours of work. First at the diner where the morning shift left me smelling like coffee and burnt toast, then here where I became invisible among the suits and corner offices. The mop became my dance partner as the chorus swelled, and I let myself spin once, twice. My reflection caught in those endless windows that showed the city spread out below like a carpet of stars, close enough to touch but impossibly far from my world of overdue bills and medical invoices that kept stacking higher no matter how many hours I worked. Just finish this floor, I muttered to myself in Spanish, the language of my childhood and my grandmother's prayers. Then you can go home to Abuela and Marco, check that his fever finally broke, make sure she took her evening medications, maybe sleep for 4 hours before starting again tomorrow. My feet ached in shoes held together with super glue. My lower back screamed from bending and scrubbing. But the song lifted something inside my chest, made me remember that I used to dream of stages and spotlights instead of mop buckets and industrial cleaning solution. I twirled again, letting the music take me somewhere else, somewhere where I wasn't Luna Vega, the janitor with 2 jobs and mounting debt from grandmother's dialysis treatments, where I wasn't the single mother whose ex disappeared the moment he saw that positive pregnancy test, where I was just a woman singing and dancing without worry creasing her forehead or fear tightening her shoulders. The executive floor stretched empty and silent around me. All those important people gone home to their families and their comfortable lives, leaving behind only their garbage and their coffee-stained carpets for someone like me to erase before morning arrived, and they returned to pretend people like me didn't exist. I pushed the mop toward the corner office, the big one with the name Diego Torres etched on a brass plate, the CEO who I'd never actually seen in person despite cleaning his space 5 nights a week for the past 3 months. The door stood slightly ajar, unusual but not alarming, because everyone was always gone by now. Everyone except me and the night security guard who nodded without really seeing me when I signed in downstairs. I nudged the door wider with my shoulder, still singing, still lost in the melody that connected me to my mother's memory, completely unaware that my entire life was about to change, that someone was watching from the shadows, that fate had just set its trap, and I had walked into it with a mop in my hands and a song on my lips. My hand was already pushing my cleaning cart through the doorway when I saw him, and my heart stopped dead in my chest, like someone had reached inside and squeezed it with an icy fist. A man sat behind the enormous desk in what should have been an empty office, illuminated only by the golden glow of a single lamp that cast shadows across his face and made him look like something from a dream or maybe a nightmare. He wasn't moving, just sitting there perfectly still with his attention fixed on multiple computer screens showing what looked like security camera footage. And even in my shock, I registered that he was strikingly handsome in a way that seemed almost unfair. Sharp cheekbones and strong jaw covered in dark stubble, black hair pushed back from his forehead, dressed in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that spoke of controlled power. The moment I stumbled through that door, he paused whatever he was watching and turned those eyes on me, dark and intense and seeing too much, and I felt pinned in place like a butterfly on a collector's board. "Mr. Torres?" I stammered, my earbuds falling from my ears to dangle against my neck where my pulse hammered visible and frantic. "I am so sorry. I thought everyone was gone. I will come back later. I should not have. I will just go." I was already backing toward the door, mortification burning through my exhaustion like acid, imagining the phone call from my supervisor tomorrow morning telling me my services were no longer needed, trying to calculate how I would pay next month's rent with only one job. He stood then, unfolding from his chair with a grace that seemed wrong for someone so tall and broad-shouldered, and when he moved around the desk, I noticed he favored his right side slightly, something careful in how he carried himself. "You have a beautiful voice," he said, and his accent wrapped around the English words like warm honey, thicker than I expected for someone born in this country, the Colombian roots showing through stronger when he seemed surprised or maybe pleased. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him, I could see rain beginning to fall, drops catching the city lights and sliding down the glass like tears. And the office around us felt enormous and intimate all at once, with its expensive leather furniture and artwork that even I recognized as valuable. Paintings of Colombian landscapes and colonial architecture. A whole wall dedicated to bottles of tequila and whiskey that probably cost more than I made in a year. I stood frozen with my mop still in hand, cleaning supplies rattling slightly on my cart because my hands were shaking, completely unsure what to say or do, or how to escape this moment that felt charged with something I did not understand. He was watching me with an expression I could not read, curiosity maybe, or something warmer and more dangerous. And I realized with a start that he must have been listening to me sing through the door, must have heard every off-key note and probably laughed at the cleaning woman who thought she was alone. "Please," I tried again. "I did not mean to disturb you. I know you are very important and busy, and I am nobody. I will go now." But even as I said it, I found I could not make my feet move backward, could not tear my eyes away from his face, from the way he looked at me like I was someone worth seeing, instead of just another invisible worker in a building full of ghosts. He gestured to one of the leather chairs facing his desk and said, "Sit, please." And it was not quite a command, but not quite a request either, something in between that made my legs move before my brain could decide whether this was a good idea or the worst mistake of my night. I perched on the very edge of the chair, like a bird ready to take flight, my cleaning cart abandoned by the door, my hands twisting together in my lap, because I did not know what else to do with them, while he leaned against his desk with his arms crossed, studying me with an intensity that made my skin feel too tight. "That song," he said after a moment, that stretched like pulled taffy, "where did you learn it?" "Because it is not something you hear on the radio or in clubs. It is old. From the mountains." My throat felt dry as desert sand, but I managed to answer. "My mother used to sing it to me when I was small. She learned it from her mother in Colombia before they came here. She would hum it while she cooked or cleaned or braided my hair, and then I stopped because suddenly my eyes were burning, and I did not want to cry in front of this powerful stranger in his expensive office. She passed when I was 15, I added quietly, cancer, and we could not afford the treatments that might have saved her, which was too much information, but somehow it felt important to say out loud to someone who was actually listening. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes that made him look younger despite the hardness that lived in the set of his jaw, and he said so softly I almost did not hear it, "Mine too. I have not heard that song in 20 years, not since before she died." The rain was falling harder now, drumming against the windows and blurring the city lights into watercolor smears of gold and white and red, and the office suddenly felt smaller, more intimate, like we were the only two people left in the world. He moved to the window and stood with his back to me, hands in his pockets, shoulders tight with something that might have been old pain, or maybe just tiredness from whatever security issues had kept him here so late. "My mother came from a small village in the mountains outside Cali," he said to the glass, his reflection ghostly in the rain-streaked surface. "She sang that song when she missed home, when she felt trapped in this country my father brought her to for his business." I found myself standing without deciding to, moving closer but not too close, drawn by the unexpected vulnerability in his voice. "My family is from near there too," I said. "A village so small it does not even have a name on most maps. My grandmother still talks about the coffee farms and the mountains that touched the clouds." He turned then and looked at me with new interest, really looked at me, not through me or past me the way most people in suits looked at janitors, and I saw that his eyes were not just brown, but had flecks of gold in them that caught the lamplight. "What is your name?" he asked. "Your real name, not the one on your employee badge." Luna, I answered. Luna Vega. And my son is Marco. He is 5, and he has my mother's eyes. And my grandmother Rosa lives with us. She is the one who taught my mother the song. He nodded slowly like I had just told him something significant, something that mattered. And I felt confused by the attention, by the fact that we were having this conversation at all when he should have dismissed me, or complained about my singing disturbing his work. I want you to work for me, he said suddenly, directly, pulling a business card from his desk drawer and writing something on the back with a pen that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. The words hung in the air between us like smoke, and I felt my spine straighten, my defenses rising up sharp and quick, because I had heard offers before from men who thought a struggling woman was easy prey. I am not that kind of woman, Mr. Torres, I said clearly despite the trembling in my hands, standing up so fast the leather chair rolled backward and hit the wall. His eyes darkened to almost black, and he set the pen down with careful precision, his jaw tightening for just a moment before his expression smoothed into something unreadable. I am aware, he said, his voice dropping lower, colder. I am offering you a legitimate position as my personal assistant, managing my schedule, accompanying me to events, handling certain private matters that require discretion and intelligence. The number he had written on the card sat face down on the desk between us, and I could feel it pulling at me like gravity, even though I had not seen what it said. Your son deserves better than watching his mother work herself to death at 2 jobs that barely pay enough to keep you in that apartment, with the broken heater and the landlord who charges too much for too little, he continued, and my blood turned to ice in my veins because how did he know about Marco, about where we lived, about the heater that had been broken since October? I must have shown my shock because he gestured to the computer screens behind him where security footage was paused. I see everyone who comes through this building, Luna. I see you arrive at 11 every night. I see the exhaustion in how you move. I see you counting change in the break room to buy coffee from the vending machine. The rain was pounding against the windows now, a storm rolling in from the coast, and the office felt charged with electricity like lightning was about to strike. I wanted to be angry about the invasion of privacy, about him watching me without my knowledge. But underneath the anger was something else, something that felt dangerously like hope trying to bloom in cracked concrete. How much? I heard myself ask, hating the desperate edge in my voice, but unable to stop myself from reaching for the card, from flipping it over to see the number written in his bold handwriting. What I saw made my knees weak, made my vision swim, because it was 10 times what I made at both my jobs combined. Enough to pay for grandmother's treatments, enough to move Marco to a better school, enough to stop drowning and maybe, finally, breathe. This is too much, I whispered. Nobody pays this much for an assistant. What do you really want from me? He moved around the desk then, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and woody that made my head spin. I want your time, he said simply. Your loyalty, your presence at my side when I need you. Nothing more and nothing less than what I have stated. But I could see in his eyes that there was more he was not saying, layers of meaning I did not yet understand. And my pride warred with my desperation while the card burned in my hand like a lottery ticket or maybe a deal with the devil. I set the card down on his desk with fingers that shook despite my best efforts to keep them steady and looked him straight in his impossibly dark eyes. I clean for a living, but I am nobody's charity case, I said, and my voice came out stronger than I felt inside where panic was already whispering that I was making a terrible mistake, that I was turning down the answer to prayers I had been sending up to heaven every night on my knees beside my bed. I do not know what game you are playing, Mr. Torres, but I cannot afford to be anyone's temporary amusement or unclear obligation. I have a son and a grandmother depending on me, and I will not risk what little stability we have for something that sounds too good to be true, because in my experience, those things always are. He did not move to stop me as I turned toward my cleaning cart, did not raise his voice or show anger, just stood there watching me with an expression I could not read. something that might have been respect or maybe amusement dancing at the corners of his mouth. I grabbed my cart with hands that betrayed me by trembling, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape. And I pushed toward the door without looking back, because if I looked back, I might see that number again, and my resolve would crumble like wet sand. The hallway stretched before me impossibly long and empty, fluorescent lights humming their lonely song, marble floors reflecting my distorted image back at me, a woman in a janitor's uniform walking away from more money than she had ever seen in her life. My feet felt heavy as concrete blocks, and my chest ached with the weight of what I had just refused. But I kept walking because dignity was all I had left when everything else had been stripped away by circumstance and bad luck and a man who left me pregnant and alone. Behind me, I heard nothing, no footsteps following, no voice calling me back, just silence that felt louder than any argument. The elevator took forever to arrive, and when the doors finally opened, I nearly collapsed inside, jabbing the button for the ground floor with a finger that left a smudge on the polished brass. As the elevator descended, I felt like I was sinking into dark water, drowning in the choice I had just made, wondering if I had just thrown away my grandmother's chance at proper treatment, Marco's chance at a better life, my own chance at something more than exhausted survival. The numbers above the door counted down, and with each floor I felt more certain I had made a mistake, and more determined that I had done the right thing, the two feelings twisting together until I could not tell them apart. When I finally stumbled out into the lobby, the night security guard looked up from his phone and nodded the same unseeing nod he always gave me. And I signed out with a hand that still shook, my signature barely legible. Outside, the rain had turned the city into a watercolor painting, all running colors and blurred edges, and I stood under the building's overhang, trying to remember where I had parked my car, a 15-year-old Honda that broke down more often than it ran. Back in his office, 40 floors above, Diego Torres stood at his window watching the street below, watching a small figure emerge into the rain and hurry toward the parking garage, and he said quietly to the empty room, "No, you are definitely not." And the smile that crossed his face held certainty and patience and something darker that suggested this was far from over. The morning arrived gray and cold, the kind of October day that promised winter was coming, whether you were ready or not. And I dragged myself to the diner after only 3 hours of sleep, with Marco's goodbye kiss still warm on my cheek, and grandmother's worried eyes following me out the door. Something felt wrong the moment the bus turned onto Fletcher Street because the diner's neon sign was dark, even though we should have been open for the breakfast rush, and as we got closer, I could see a small crowd of my coworkers gathered on the sidewalk, their faces confused and angry and scared. The chain looped through the door handles gleamed in the weak sunlight, thick and official and final. And the notices plastered across the windows screamed their bad news in bold red letters that made my stomach drop like a stone down a well. Maria grabbed my arm the moment I stepped off the bus, her eyes red from crying, her voice shaking when she said they arrested Jimmy last night. Money laundering for some gang, the feds shut us down, we are all out of work just like that. I stared at the chain, at the notices, at the diner where I had worked for 3 years slinging coffee and eggs, and smiling at truckers who left $2 tips, and my brain tried to do math that would not add up no matter how I arranged the numbers. Rent was due in 3 days, $800 that I did not have, and grandmother's medication refill was tomorrow, another $200 that insurance would not cover, and Marco needed new shoes because his toes were pushing through the front of the ones he had, and the electric bill was already overdue by 2 weeks. "What are we going to do?" Maria asked, clutching my arm tighter. "I got 3 kids and my husband just lost his construction job. What are we going to do, Luna?" "I do not know," I heard myself say, the words coming from far away, like someone else was using my voice. "I do not know." The other waitresses and the line cook and the dishwasher all stood around looking at each other with the same expression, the look of people who lived paycheck to paycheck watching their lifeline get cut, and I wanted to comfort them, but I could barely breathe through my own panic. I walked to the bus stop on legs that felt numb and disconnected from my body, and sat down hard on the plastic bench, my phone clutched in both hands like a lifeline, or maybe a bomb. The cleaning job alone would not be enough, would not even come close to covering what I needed, and there were no other jobs hiring that would work around my night schedule. Nothing that paid more than minimum wage for someone with no college degree and a 5-year gap in her resume from when Marco was small. The gray sky pressed down on me like a weight, like the universe itself was trying to crush me into the pavement, and I thought about that business card sitting on Diego Torres's desk, about the number written on the back in bold, confident handwriting, about how I had walked away from it with my pride intact and my dignity defended. Pride does not pay rent, my grandmother's voice whispered in my memory. Pride does not buy medicine or food or keep the lights on. I pulled up my phone and stared at the screen, at the contact list that held no answers, at the calculator app where I had tried 100 times to make my money stretch further than it could possibly go. Around me, the city moved on with its business, people hurrying to jobs they still had, cars splashing through puddles left by last night's rain. The world utterly indifferent to the fact that mine was crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide. I was still sitting at that bus stop trying to figure out how to breathe through the panic squeezing my chest, when the black SUV pulled up to the curb, sleek and expensive and utterly out of place in this neighborhood of cracked sidewalks and chain-link fences. Everything about it screamed money and power, from its tinted windows to its gleaming paint job that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent, and I found myself standing without meaning to, backing away toward the bus shelter like prey that had just spotted a predator. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered in a dark suit that fit him like it had been made specifically for his body, sunglasses hiding his eyes even though the morning was gray and sunless. He did not speak, did not smile, just walked around the front of the vehicle with measured steps and held out a manila envelope toward me, like he was delivering something completely ordinary instead of appearing out of nowhere on what was already the worst morning of my life. I stared at the envelope, at his expressionless face, at the SUV idling at the curb with its engine purring like a satisfied cat, and my hands started shaking before I even reached out to take it. The moment my fingers closed around the thick paper, he nodded once, turned on his heel, and climbed back into the driver's seat, pulling away from the curb and disappearing into traffic before I could find my voice to ask questions I was not sure I wanted answered. Other people at the bus stop were staring at me now, the woman who delivered newspapers, and the man who worked overnight at the warehouse, and the teenager with his skateboard, all of them wondering what business someone like me had with a vehicle like that. My hands trembled so badly I almost dropped the envelope twice before I managed to open it, my heart hammering against my ribs like it was trying to escape my chest. Inside was a single piece of heavy cardstock, expensive paper that felt substantial between my fingers, with a message written in bold handwriting that I recognized from the business card I had left on his desk last night. "The offer stands," it read. "My driver will be here tomorrow morning at 8. The choice is yours." And it was signed simply DT in sharp, angular letters that somehow conveyed confidence and certainty and inevitability. But it was what else was in the envelope that made my knees go weak, made the world tilt sideways until I had to sit down hard on the bench before I fell. A check, printed on thick paper with Diego Torres's name embossed at the top, made out to me for $10,000. The memo line reading "advance on salary" in that same bold handwriting. My vision blurred as I stared at the number, at more zeros than I had ever seen on anything with my name on it, and my hands shook so hard the check rattled like a leaf in wind. Underneath the check were papers, medical bills from the hospital where my grandmother received her dialysis treatments, statements I recognized because I had been making tiny payments on them for 2 years. Amounts that barely covered the interest, while the principal loomed over us like a mountain we would never climb. but someone had taken a red stamp to each one, marking them in bold letters that made my breath catch in my throat. Paid in full, they all said. Paid in full, paid in full, paid in full. I flipped through them, with fingers gone numb, watching thousands and thousands of dollars of debt disappear under that red stamp, and I did not know whether to laugh or cry or scream. He had done this. Diego Torres had somehow gotten access to my grandmother's medical records and paid every single bill, had erased debt that would have followed me for decades, had changed my life with the stroke of a pen, and I had not even said yes to his offer yet. I took the bus to the hospital where grandmother received her treatments, my hands still clutching the envelope like it might disappear if I let go, and when I walked up to the billing office, the woman behind the desk looked at me with something like pity mixed with confusion. "Your account shows a zero balance, Mrs. Vega," she said after typing grandmother's name into her computer. "Everything was paid in full yesterday afternoon by cashier's check. You do not owe us anything." The words should have brought relief, but instead they made something crack open inside my chest, made the reality of what Diego Torres had done crash over me like a wave, and I heard myself thanking her in a voice that did not sound like mine, before stumbling toward the public restroom down the hall. I barely made it into a stall before the tears came, hot and desperate and furious, because I did not know if I was crying from gratitude or rage or fear or the overwhelming weight of an obligation I had not asked for but now carried anyway. He had bought me, or maybe he had saved me, and I could not tell the difference between the two, could not separate my anger at being manipulated from my desperate relief that grandmother would be okay, that the crushing weight of her medical debt had been lifted from my shoulders by a man I barely knew. I leaned against the cold tile wall and let myself fall apart for 3 minutes by the clock above the sinks, 3 minutes to be weak and scared and human. And then I straightened my spine and walked to the mirror where harsh fluorescent lighting showed me exactly what I looked like, a 26-year-old woman with circles under her eyes and cheap clothes and no options left. I pulled out my phone and the business card with Diego Torres's private number written on the back, the one I had refused last night with my dignity intact and my pride defended, and I stared at those numbers until they blurred and came back into focus. My finger hovered over the screen, over the point of no return, and I thought about Marco, who deserved new shoes and a better school, about grandmother who deserved to live without pain, about myself and what I was willing to sacrifice for the people I loved. I pressed call before I could change my mind, and he answered on the first ring like he had been sitting there waiting, like he had known exactly when I would break. "Tomorrow," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, 8 in the morning, "but I need to know what exactly you are expecting from me, Mr. Torres, what this really is, because I am not stupid, and I know this is not just about scheduling your appointments." There was a pause, a moment where I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, and when he spoke his voice was low and certain and utterly without apology. "Your time," he said, each word deliberate and weighted, "your loyalty, your presence at my side when I need you, and eventually Luna, everything. But I am a patient man, and I understand that trust must be earned." I closed my eyes and saw my reflection in the dark bathroom mirror, saw the moment of my surrender written across my face. "This is not really about a job," I said, and it was not a question. "No," he agreed, his voice carrying something that might have been satisfaction, or triumph, or maybe just honesty. "It is about much more than that. But we will take it one step at a time. You have my word that you and your family will be protected and provided for. That is not a promise I make lightly." The fluorescent lights hummed above me, and somewhere down the hall a baby was crying, and the normal world kept spinning while mine tilted on its axis and changed direction completely. "8 tomorrow morning," I repeated, "and where exactly will your driver be taking me?" "Home," he said simply. "To my home, because what I am offering you, Luna, is not a job in an office. It is a place in my life, and that begins with you seeing exactly what that life looks like." I should have hung up, should have run, should have chosen poverty and pride over whatever trap I was walking into. But instead I heard myself say, okay, and the word felt like stepping off a cliff into empty air. I will see you tomorrow then, he said. And Luna, thank you for trusting me with this. I did not trust him, not yet, maybe not ever, but I had run out of choices, and he knew it. Had probably known it from the moment he watched me on those security cameras singing while I cleaned. Had planned this entire thing with the patience of a hunter who knows his prey has nowhere left to run. The black SUV arrived at exactly 8 in the morning in front of our apartment building, the same vehicle from yesterday, and this time when the driver got out, he opened the back door and waited with the patience of someone who had all the time in the world. Marco pressed his face against my leg, his small hand gripping mine tight, his eyes wide as he stared at the fancy car that looked like it belonged in a movie instead of on our street with its potholes and overflowing dumpsters. "Is that for us, Mama?" he whispered, and I nodded because my throat was too tight to speak, because I was loading my 5-year-old son into a stranger's vehicle and driving toward a future I could not see or predict. The driver's name was Vincent, he told us as he closed our door with a solid, expensive thunk, and he would be available whenever we needed transportation, his voice professional and neutral like driving women and children to mysterious destinations was just another Tuesday. I held Marco on my lap. Even though there was plenty of room on the leather seats, needing his weight and warmth to ground me as we drove through the city, leaving behind our neighborhood of struggling families and broken dreams, heading toward streets that grew wider and cleaner, houses that grew larger and farther apart, wealth that stopped trying to hide itself behind gates and hedges. When we finally turned onto a private drive that seemed to go on forever, winding through manicured gardens and past fountains that sparkled in the morning sun, I felt my stomach drop because this was not an office building, this was someone's home, and that someone was Diego Torres. The estate rose before us like something from a dream, or maybe a fairy tale, all white stucco walls and red tile roofs, Spanish colonial architecture that spoke of old money and older traditions, and I realized with a sinking certainty that I had completely miscalculated what he meant by working for him. Staff members lined the entrance, men and women in neat uniforms, and at the center of them stood Diego himself, dressed more casually than I had seen him before, in dark jeans and a white shirt, but somehow even more intimidating in this setting that was clearly his kingdom. Vincent opened our door, and I climbed out on shaking legs, pulling Marco with me, and Diego walked toward us with long, confident strides, the morning sun catching in his dark hair and making his eyes look almost warm. But it was what he did next that shocked me into stillness. Shocked me because it was so unexpected and gentle. Because he dropped into a crouch so he was at Marco's eye level instead of towering over him like the imposing figure he was. "Your mama tells me you like dinosaurs," Diego said to my son, his voice softer than I had ever heard it, his accent wrapping around the words like a caress. "I have something to show you if that is okay with your mama." Marco looked up at me with hope shining in his face, the kind of pure excitement that only children can manage, and I found myself nodding even though every maternal instinct was screaming that this was too much, too fast, too strange. "Are you Mama's new boss?" Marco asked with the blunt honesty of a 5-year-old, and Diego's lips curved into something that might have been a real smile. "Something like that," he replied, standing and offering his hand to Marco, who took it without hesitation, because children have not yet learned to fear powerful men in expensive houses. I followed them through massive wooden doors into an entrance hall that took my breath away. All marble floors and soaring ceilings and artwork that belonged in museums, and I wanted to grab Marco and run back to our tiny apartment where at least I understood the rules and knew what was expected. A woman appeared, older and kind-faced, introducing herself as Carmen and explaining that she managed the household staff and would I like to see my quarters, while Mr. Torres showed Marco the playroom that had been prepared. My quarters, not an office, not a desk somewhere, but rooms where I would apparently be living, And the trap I had walked into closed around me with velvet jaws that were no less final for being comfortable. Carmen guided me through the estate with the efficiency of someone who had done this tour many times before, her sensible shoes clicking against marble and tile as we moved through room after room that seemed designed to remind me how far I was from my world of secondhand furniture and peeling paint. The East Wing holds the family quarters, she explained in her gentle, accented voice, her words carrying the warmth of someone's grandmother, even as she described a house that could fit 20 of my apartments inside it with room to spare, and the West Wing is for business meetings, and Mr. Torres's private offices. I followed in a daze, trying to memorize the layout while my brain struggled to process the sheer scale of wealth surrounding me. The artwork that must cost millions, the furniture that looked antique and priceless, the windows that stretched from floor to ceiling showing gardens that went on forever. Men in dark suits appeared and disappeared as we walked, talking quietly into phones or earpieces, their eyes constantly scanning, and I noticed the way Carmen nodded to them with familiarity, the way they stepped aside to let us pass. "Security," she said when she caught me staring. "Mr. Torres takes the safety of his household very seriously. The family business requires certain precautions." "Family business," I repeated, and something about the way she said it made my skin prickle with awareness, made pieces start clicking together in my head that I had been deliberately not looking at. Carmen stopped at a window overlooking the courtyard where I could see Diego walking with Marco toward a stable, my son's hand still tucked trustingly in his, and she turned to look at me with eyes that were kind but also assessing. "Mr. Torres is a good man in a complicated world," she said carefully, each word chosen with precision. "He protects what is his. He provides for his people. He has built something remarkable from tragedy and loss." "I am not his," I said quickly. Too quickly, my voice sharp with fear and something else I did not want to name. Carmen's smile was sad and knowing, the expression of someone who had seen this story play out before. "Not yet, mija," she said gently. "But you will be. He does not bring women here. He does not prepare rooms for them. He certainly does not prepare entire playrooms for their children. You must understand what that means to everyone in this house." My mouth went dry as I processed her words, as I looked around at the armed men and the expensive security and the careful way everyone moved through this beautiful house, and I finally asked the question I should have asked before getting in that car. What exactly is the family business? Carmen was quiet for a long moment, studying my face like she was deciding how much truth I could handle, and then she said simply, "The Torres family controls territory throughout the city, business interests that are not always strictly legal. Mr. Torres took over the organization 10 years ago after his father was murdered by rivals. He was very young, but he has proven himself strong and smart and ruthless when he needs to be." The floor felt unsteady beneath my feet as I understood finally what I had walked into, as the pieces assembled themselves into a picture I had been deliberately avoiding. "Mafia," I whispered. "He is in the Mafia," and Carmen did not contradict me, just nodded once and squeezed my arm with surprising strength. "He will keep you safe," she said firmly. "You and your son and your grandmother. No one will touch what belongs to Diego Torres. That is worth something in this world, yes." I thought about the medical bills paid in full, about the check for $10,000, about the way he had known everything about me from watching security cameras, and I realized that I had not just accepted a job, I had accepted protection and obligation, and a place in a world where violence and power were currency, and the rules I had lived by my entire life no longer applied. Dinner was served in a formal dining room that felt larger than it needed to be for just 3 people, candles flickering on a table that could seat 20, staff moving silently to place dish after dish in front of us while I tried to figure out which fork to use and felt my face burning with embarrassment. Marco sat between Diego and me in a chair that had been fitted with cushions to bring him to the right height, and he chattered away happily about the horses and the playroom full of dinosaurs and the nice lady named Carmen who had given him cookies, completely oblivious to the tension stringing my shoulders tight as wire. Diego watched me struggle with the fancy silverware, watched me try to cut my meat with shaking hands, and then he did something that surprised me more than anything else that day. He dismissed the staff with a quiet gesture and reached across to help Marco cut his chicken into small pieces. I grew up eating rice and beans on a fold-out table in a two-room apartment that my mother cleaned houses to afford, he said conversationally, as if we were discussing the weather instead of his past. This, he gestured around the room with its crystal chandeliers and oil paintings and china that probably cost more per plate than my monthly rent. This is not who I am, it is what I built, but it does not change where I came from. His words hung in the candlelit space, and I found myself looking at him differently, seeing past the expensive clothes and the powerful presence to something underneath that, recognized struggle and hardship. Why me? I asked. The question that had been burning in my chest since yesterday. You could have anyone, women who know how to use the right fork and wear the right clothes and fit into this world. Why choose someone like me? Marco was focused on his chicken, humming to himself between bites, and Diego's eyes met mine across the table with an intensity that made my breath catch. Because those women would see only what I have built and never understand what it cost, he said quietly. Because when I heard you singing that song my mother used to sing, I remembered who I was before all this, before the power and the money and the weight of responsibility. And I have not felt that way in 10 years. The honesty in his voice disarmed me, made my defenses crack just slightly, and I saw the exhaustion living in the lines around his eyes, the burden of whatever empire he controlled pressing down on shoulders that were broad enough to carry it, but still human underneath. When my father was murdered, I was 24 years old and suddenly responsible for hundreds of people, for territory and business and vengeance, Diego continued. And I became hard because I had to, became ruthless because anything less would have gotten everyone I cared about killed. But sometimes, I miss the boy who believed in simple things. His hand rested on the table between us, and I noticed scars on his knuckles, old and faded, but speaking of violence he had done himself, not just ordered others to do. You remind me of my mother, he said. Not in how you look, but in your strength, in the way you work 2 jobs to take care of your family, in the way you walked away from my offer, even though you desperately needed the money. She would have done the same thing. She had that same pride that would not bend, even when bending would have been easier. Marco finished his chicken and announced he was full, and Diego smiled at him with genuine warmth before suggesting that Carmen could show him the garden fountains before bedtime. After my son left the room with Carmen's gentle guidance, the silence felt different, more charged, and I found myself saying things I had not planned to say. I am scared, I admitted. Scared of this world, scared of what it means that you paid my grandmother's bills, scared that I have no idea what you really want from me. Diego nodded slowly like he had expected my fear, like he respected it. I want you to sing, he said simply. Not just with your voice, but with your whole life. I want to give you the freedom to be happy instead of exhausted. I want Marco to grow up safe and educated. I want your grandmother to live without pain. And yes, Luna, I want you. I wanted you from the moment I saw you dancing with a mop and singing like no one was watching. After Carmen took Marco to the room that had been prepared for him with dinosaur sheets and a nightlight shaped like a T-Rex, Diego led me through the house to what he called my quarters, and with each step, my heart beat faster because I knew something was coming, some revelation that would make everything clear and terrible. He opened a door to reveal a suite that was more beautiful than any place I had ever stayed, all cream and gold with a bed big enough for 4 people, a sitting area with a fireplace, windows that overlooked the gardens now lit by soft landscape lighting. My clothes had already been unpacked. My few shabby possessions hung in a closet designed to hold a wardrobe 10 times that size, and on the dresser sat a framed photo of Marco and me that had been on my nightstand just this morning. I turned to confront him about the presumption of moving my things without asking, about the invasion of my privacy, but the words died in my throat when I saw the open door on the far wall of the sitting room, saw through it to another bedroom decorated in darker colors, masculine and clearly his. "This is too close," I said, my voice coming out shakier than I wanted. "The rooms are connected. This is not appropriate for an employer and employee." Diego leaned against the doorframe of my new bedroom, arms crossed over his chest, and the look he gave me was patient and predatory all at once. "You will be my wife within 3 months, Luna," he said calmly, like he was discussing the weather instead of my future. "I am showing considerable restraint by not claiming you tonight, by giving you time to adjust to this new life before I make you fully mine." The floor seemed to tilt beneath my feet, and I grabbed the back of a chair to steady myself. "I never agreed to marriage," I said, anger finally breaking through my shock. "You offered me a job, you paid my grandmother's bills, you never said anything about marriage." Diego pushed off from the doorframe and moved into my space, close enough that I could smell his cologne and feel the heat coming off his body, close enough to be overwhelming without actually touching me. "You will," he said with absolute certainty, his voice dropping lower and sending shivers down my spine despite my anger. "You will agree because you are already mine in every way that matters. You just have not accepted it yet. But you will, Luna. I promise you that." His arrogance should have made me furious, should have sent me running from this room and this house and this man who thought he could just decide my future without my consent, but instead I felt something dangerous unfurling in my chest, something that recognized the truth in his words, even as my mind rejected them. "I am not some prize to be claimed," I said, backing toward the window to put distance between us. "I am a person with my own choices, my own life." He followed me with slow, measured steps, a hunter who knew his prey had nowhere to run. "You are a woman who has been fighting alone for too long," he countered. "A woman who has sacrificed everything for the people she loves and never asked for anything in return. Let me give you what you need, Luna. Let me take care of you and Marco and your grandmother. Let me show you what it feels like to be protected and cherished instead of exhausted and afraid." My back hit the window, and he stopped just beyond arm's reach, giving me space but making his presence impossible to ignore. "I do not need you," I whispered, but the lie tasted bitter on my tongue because we both knew it was not true, knew that I was standing in his house wearing clothes he had moved, that my son was sleeping down the hall in a bed he provided, that my grandmother's life had been saved by money he gave. "You do," he said gently, "and I need you more than you know. But I am a patient man, Luna. I will wait for you to come to me willingly, to choose this life and this future. But make no mistake, you will choose it. The only question is how long you will fight the inevitable." He turned to leave then, pausing at the door between our rooms. "The door stays open," he said, "so I can hear if you or Marco need anything during the night, so you know that I am close enough to protect you, but far enough to let you breathe. Sleep well, Luna. Tomorrow we begin teaching you what it means to be at my side." I woke to sunlight streaming through windows I did not recognize and spent 3 panicked seconds trying to remember where I was before it all came crashing back. The estate, Diego Torres, the connected bedrooms, and his promise that I would be his wife. The door between our rooms stood open just as he had left it, but his bedroom beyond was empty, the bed already made with military precision that suggested he had been up for hours. I found Marco in the kitchen having breakfast with Carmen, his face smeared with syrup, and his laughter filling the space as she told him stories in Spanish. And when he saw me, he announced that Carmen was teaching him to make arepas, and could he please have a puppy, because Mr. Diego said there was room for one. I kissed the top of his head and accepted the coffee Carmen pressed into my hands, dark and strong and exactly what I needed, and asked where Diego had gone. "The gym," Carmen said with a knowing smile that made my cheeks burn. "He trains every morning at 6. You will find him in the east wing past the library if you wish to speak with him. I should have stayed in the kitchen, should have kept myself far away from Diego Torres until I absolutely had to see him. But my feet carried me through the house, following Carmen's directions, until I heard the sound of impact, fist against leather, and found myself standing in the doorway of a private gym that looked like something from a magazine. Diego was in the center of the space wearing only loose training pants and a black tank top that showed arms corded with muscle, his skin gleaming with sweat as he moved around a heavy bag with lethal grace, each punch precise and controlled, and powerful enough that I could hear the chain holding the bag creak. A trainer stood nearby calling combinations in Spanish, and I watched from the doorway without meaning to watch, unable to look away from the display of raw physical power and controlled violence. He must have sensed my presence because his eyes found mine in the mirrored wall, and something flickered in his expression, satisfaction maybe, or triumph at catching me watching him. He said something to the trainer who nodded and left immediately, passing me with a respectful nod, and then we were alone in the space that suddenly felt smaller and more intimate than it should have. "You should eat," Diego said without preamble, unwrapping tape from his hands with efficient movements, his chest still rising and falling from exertion. "We have an event tonight, and you will need your strength." I forced myself to step into the gym, to maintain eye contact instead of staring at the way his tank top clung to his body, at the scars I could now see marking his ribs and shoulder. "What kind of event?" I asked, trying to sound professional and in control despite the way my heart was racing. "The kind where you will be introduced as mine," he replied, picking up a towel and wiping sweat from his face and neck. "Several allied families gather monthly to discuss business and territory. Tonight you will stand at my side, and everyone will know that you are under my protection." I shook my head, backing toward the door. I did not agree to be paraded around like some trophy. I am not ready for whatever this is. Diego closed the distance between us in 3 long strides, not touching me but surrounding me with his presence, with the heat coming off his body and the smell of clean sweat and mail. "You are ready," he said firmly, "and you will do this because the moment you accepted my money and moved into my home, you became part of my world, which means my enemies will already be looking for weaknesses, for people I care about who they can use against me. Better they see you strong and confident at my side than vulnerable and hiding." The logic was sound even as it terrified me, and I realized with growing dread that there was no going back now, that I had crossed a line without fully understanding what waited on the other side. The stylists arrived at 3 in the afternoon, like an invading army, 3 women and 1 man carrying garment bags and makeup cases and equipment I could not name, transforming my bedroom suite into something between a salon and a battlefield. Carmen supervised everything with quiet authority while I stood in the center of the chaos feeling like a doll about to be dressed for display, and when I tried to protest that this was too much, that I could do my own hair and makeup, Carmen just smiled and said that Diego had specific expectations for tonight, and we would meet them. They started with my hair, washing and conditioning it, with products that smelled like flowers and probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Then one woman began cutting, while another prepared hot rollers, and the man set up lights and mirrors. I watched in the reflection as inches of my dark hair fell to the floor, as expert hands shaped and styled until waves cascaded over my shoulders in a way I had never achieved on my own. The makeup came next, foundation and concealer, covering the exhaustion that lived permanently under my eyes, eyeshadow in shades of gold and bronze that made my brown eyes look mysterious, lipstick in deep red that transformed my mouth into something sensual and confident. When they finally let me look at myself properly, I barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked expensive and polished, and nothing like Luna Vega who cleaned office buildings at night. The dress came last, carried in on a hanger by one of the stylists, like it was made of spun glass instead of fabric, emerald green silk that caught the late afternoon light and shimmered like water. I'm a janitor, in an expensive dress, I said to Carmen as they zipped me into it, watching the woman in the mirror transform into someone who could belong at Diego's side, someone who looked like she was born to wear diamonds and walk through rooms full of powerful men. Carmen's reflection met mine in the glass, her expression firm but kind. No, mija, she said. You are whatever you decide to be. Diego sees a queen when he looks at you. Perhaps it is time you saw her too. The dress fit like it had been made for my body, hugging curves I usually hid under loose clothes and falling to the floor in a sweep of silk that whispered when I moved. But it was what Carmen brought out next that made my breath catch. A velvet box that opened to reveal a diamond necklace and matching earrings that caught the light and threw rainbows across the walls. These belonged to Diego's mother, Carmen said softly, reverently, placing the necklace around my throat with gentle hands. He has never let anyone wear them before. Do you understand what that means, Luna? What he is telling everyone by giving these to you? The diamonds were cold against my skin and impossibly heavy. The weight of expectation and history, and a dead woman's place that I was being asked to fill. I stared at my reflection, at this stranger who looked confident and beautiful and utterly terrified underneath the polish, and I realized that Diego was not just introducing me to his world tonight, he was claiming me publicly, marking me as his in a way that everyone would understand, and I could never take back. Carmen adjusted the necklace, tucked a strand of my hair behind my ear where the diamond earrings caught the light, and said quietly, "You have a choice right now. You can take off the dress and the jewels and walk away. Diego would let you go if you truly wanted to leave, but if you walk out that door tonight wearing his mother's diamonds, there is no going back. You will be his in the eyes of everyone who matters." I touched the necklace with trembling fingers, felt the cold weight of diamonds and obligation and possibility, and thought about Marco sleeping safely down the hall, about grandmother receiving treatment that was no longer crushing us with debt, about the way Diego had looked at me this morning in the gym like I was something precious instead of invisible. The woman in the mirror looked back at me with eyes that held fear and determination in equal measure, and I realized Carmen was right. I had a choice. Maybe the last real choice I would have for a long time, walk away now, or step fully into Diego Torres's world and accept everything that came with it. Diego waited at the bottom of the staircase as I descended, his eyes tracking my movement with an intensity that made me hyper-aware of every step in heels higher than I had ever worn, and when I reached him, he took my hand and brought it to his lips without breaking eye contact. "You are breathtaking," he said, his voice low and rough in a way that sent heat through my body despite my nervousness, "and tonight everyone will know that you belong to me." The drive to the private club took 30 minutes through parts of the city I had only ever cleaned. Neighborhoods where the houses hid behind gates and security, where money was so old and established it did not need to announce itself. Diego kept his hand on my knee the entire drive, his thumb moving in small circles that were probably meant to be comforting but only made me more aware of him, of the expensive suit he wore like a second skin, of the power that radiated from him like heat. "Stay close," he murmured, as Vincent opened our door in front of a building that looked more like a mansion than a club. "Smile, but let me handle questions. These people are allies, but they are also always watching for weakness or opportunity." "I am not a doll," I said, straightening my spine and lifting my chin even though my heart was hammering against my ribs hard enough that I thought surely he could hear it. His hand found the small of my back as we walked toward the entrance, warm and possessive through the thin silk of my dress. "No," he agreed, his lips close to my ear. "You are a queen. Now act like it." The doors opened, and we stepped into a world I had only ever seen in movies, all dark wood paneling and crystal chandeliers, leather furniture worn soft by generations of powerful men making deals and destroying enemies. Cigar smoke hung in the air mixing with expensive cologne and aged whiskey, and soft music played from somewhere I could not see, something classical that spoke of old money and older traditions. Every head turned as we entered, conversations pausing mid-sentence, and I felt the weight of dozens of eyes assessing me, calculating who I was and what I meant to Diego Torres. Men nodded to Diego with respect that bordered on deference, some inclining their heads in what looked almost like bows, and I realized with a shock that he was not just powerful here, he was possibly the most powerful person in this room. Women watched me with expressions ranging from curiosity to calculation to barely concealed jealousy, their designer dresses and perfect makeup making them look like a different species than the woman I had been just hours ago. I caught whispers as we moved through the room, Spanish and English mixing together, fragments about Diego never bringing women to these events, about how he had been alone since taking over from his father, about previous relationships that never lasted because he never let anyone close. "This is unprecedented," I heard one older woman say to her companion. "He is introducing her publicly. Do you know what that means?" Diego's hand pressed more firmly against my back, guiding me through the crowd toward a private area in the back where men in expensive suits stood with drinks, their body language suggesting these were the real power brokers, the ones who made decisions that affected entire neighborhoods or maybe entire cities. I wanted to run, wanted to rip off these diamonds and this dress and return to my simple life where I understood the rules. But Diego's presence at my side was both trap and anchor, holding me in place even as I felt myself drowning in attention and expectation. A man approached us, older with silver hair and a smile that did not reach his eyes, and he spoke to Diego in rapid Spanish before turning that calculating gaze on me. "So this is the woman who has finally captured your attention," he said in English, switching languages smoothly for my benefit. "She is very beautiful, Diego. I hope she knows what she is getting into." Diego's arm moved from my back to around my waist, pulling me closer against his side in a gesture that was unmistakably possessive. "She knows exactly what she needs to know," he replied, his voice carrying an edge of warning that made the other man's smile widen with what might have been amusement or respect. We had been at the club for less than an hour, Diego introducing me to men whose names I tried to remember, and women who smiled without warmth, when a man pushed through the crowd with the confidence of someone who feared nothing and no one. He was older than Diego, maybe in his 50s, with silver-streaked black hair and a face that might have been handsome before cruelty carved lines around his mouth and eyes. "Rafael," Diego said, his voice dropping to something cold and dangerous, his entire body going rigid beside me. "I did not expect to see you here tonight." The older man smiled without any trace of humor, his eyes sliding over me like I was a piece of meat he was considering purchasing. "Where did you find this little cleaning girl, Diego?" he said in English heavily accented, his tone dripping with contempt. "Did you pull her off one of your office floors? Is this what passes for acceptable now among the Torres family?" I felt Diego move before I saw it, felt his body coil and release like a spring, and suddenly he had Rafael by the throat, slamming him back against the wall hard enough that bottles rattled on nearby tables. His voice when he spoke was barely above a whisper, but somehow more terrifying than a shout. "Apologize, or I will rip out your tongue and feed it to my dogs," Diego said, each word precise and deadly, his hand tightening on Raphael's throat until the older man's face started turning red. The room had gone completely silent, everyone watching this confrontation with the fascinated horror of people witnessing a car crash, and I could see security moving toward us, could see other men reaching for weapons hidden under expensive jackets. Something in me knew that if I did not stop this now, someone would die tonight, and whatever fragile introduction I had made to this world would be drowned in blood and violence. "Diego," I said, my voice shaking but firm, and I reached out to put my hand on his arm, feeling the muscles bunch tight as steel cable underneath his sleeve. "Stop, please. He is not worth it." For a moment, I thought he would ignore me, thought his rage would override everything else, but then his eyes flicked to mine, and I saw him fighting for control, saw the war between his protective fury and his need to show these people that I mattered to him. His hand loosened incrementally on Raphael's throat, enough that the older man could breathe, but not enough to let him escape. Raphael coughed, his eyes watering, but when he looked at me, there was something like respect, mixed with his anger. "She has teeth," he said, his voice raspy. "I approve." Diego released him with a shove that sent Raphael staggering, and he stepped back to my side, his hand finding mine and gripping it tight enough to hurt. "If you ever speak about her again, if you even look at her wrong, I will forget that our families have a truce," Diego said, his voice carrying through the silent room. "She is mine and under my protection. Anyone who disrespects her disrespects me." Raphael straightened his jacket, rubbing his throat where red marks were already forming, and he actually smiled. "Understood," he said, then to me directly. "My apologies, Señora. I did not realize Diego had finally found someone worth killing for." The crowd began moving again, conversations resuming, but I could feel the change in how people looked at us now. The respect mixed with caution, and I understood that I had just been tested and somehow passed. Diego's hand was still crushing mine, and when I looked up at his face, I saw that his jaw was tight, his breathing controlled but rapid, like he was still fighting the urge to finish what he had started. "You stopped me," he said quietly. Wonder and something darker in his voice. "No one has been able to do that in 10 years, Luna. Do you understand what that means?" I understood that I had power over him, that my voice and my touch could reach him even through rage that would terrify other men, and that power was as frightening as it was thrilling, because with it came responsibility I had not asked for and did not know how to handle. Diego guided me through glass doors onto a private balcony that overlooked the city, spread out below us like a carpet of lights, the cool night air a relief after the smoke and tension inside. He moved to the railing and pulled a silver flask from his jacket, taking a long drink before offering it to me, and when I shook my head he took another, his knuckles still white where they gripped the metal. "You almost killed him," I said, my voice shaking now that the adrenaline was fading, leaving me hollow and scared. "In front of everyone you almost killed that man for insulting me." Diego turned to face me, his expression hard in the dim light from the city below. "He disrespected you," he said simply, like that was all the explanation needed, like violence was the only possible response to words. "That is not normal," I pushed back, finding my anger through the fear. "Normal people do not try to strangle someone at a party. What is wrong with you?" Something cracked in his expression, something raw and painful bleeding through the controlled facade, and he turned back to the city, his shoulders tight with tension. "My father was shot at a dinner like this," he said quietly, his voice rough like the words were being dragged from somewhere deep. "I was 17 years old, and we were celebrating my mother's birthday, and men came through the doors with guns." The flask trembled slightly in his hand. "They shot my father first, 3 times in the chest while we all watched, while my mother screamed, and then they made her watch while they beat me, while they told her this was what happened to families who thought they were untouchable." I moved closer despite myself, drawn by the pain in his voice, by the glimpse of the boy he had been before violence shaped him into what he was now. "What happened to your mother?" I asked, though part of me did not want to know the answer. "They let her live," Diego said, turning to look at me with eyes that held old agony. "They let her live so she could tell everyone what happens when you cross the Salazar family, and she lasted 3 months before her heart just stopped. The doctors said it was a heart attack, but I knew better. She died of grief and fear and the memory of watching my father bleed out on the floor." His hand came up to loosen his tie like he could not breathe properly, and I saw that his fingers were shaking. "I spent every day since making sure no one I love is ever that vulnerable again," he continued. "I built an empire strong enough that no one would dare come for me or mine. I became the kind of man that other men fear, because fear is the only thing that keeps the people I care about safe." The words hung between us on the cool night air, and I felt something shift in my chest. some barrier cracking that I had been trying to keep solid. Is that what I am? I asked softly. Someone you love? Diego closed the distance between us in 2 steps, his hands coming up to frame my face with a gentleness that contradicted everything I had just witnessed inside. Yes, he said simply. From the moment I heard you singing that song my mother used to sing before they killed her, from the moment I saw you dancing like joy was still possible, even when you were exhausted, I knew that you were something I needed, something I had to protect. His thumbs traced my cheekbones, and I felt tears burning behind my eyes because this man who terrified me was also somehow the most honest person I had met in years. I am not some fragile thing that needs protecting, I said, but my voice lacked conviction because part of me wanted exactly what he was offering, wanted to lean into his strength and let someone else carry the weight for once. You are stronger than you know, Diego agreed. That is why you can stand at my side, why you could stop me tonight when no one else could. But strength does not mean you have to fight alone, Luna. Let me give you what I could not give my mother, safety and comfort and the freedom to sing without fear. The city lights blurred through my tears, and I realized I was falling for him, for this dangerous broken man who saw me as something precious, and I did not know if that made me smart or the biggest fool who ever lived. Diego's phone rang while we were still on the balcony, the sound cutting through the night like a knife, and I watched his face change as he answered, watched him go from the vulnerable man who had just shared his trauma to something cold and deadly in the space of a heartbeat. When, he said in Spanish, his voice flat and controlled in a way that made my blood freeze. How many? Where is Carmen? He listened for 3 seconds that stretched into eternity, and when his eyes met mine, I saw something that made my knees buckle, saw fear and rage and guilt all mixed together. Marco, I whispered, feeling the world tilt sideways. Oh God, what happened to Marco? Diego caught me before I hit the ground, his arm around my waist holding me up while he continued speaking rapid Spanish into the phone, issuing orders that I could not follow through the roaring in my ears. They took him, Diego said when he ended the call, pulling me against his chest, his heart hammering as fast as mine. They breached the estate 20 minutes ago. They hurt Carmen, but she is alive. They took Marco, and they are demanding I return territory I took from the Salazar family 3 years ago. My baby, I gasped, unable to breathe properly, my vision narrowing to a tunnel. They have my baby Diego. We have to. I have to. Listen to me, he said, gripping my shoulders and forcing me to meet his eyes. Listen, Luna, I will get him back. I swear on my mother's grave I will burn this city to the ground before I let them hurt him, but I need you to trust me, to let me do what I do. If anything happens to him, I started, but he cut me off with a finger against my lips. It will not, he said with absolute certainty. I failed to protect him, and that is my fault, my responsibility, but I will fix this. Do you understand? I will get your son back. Around us, the club had erupted into controlled chaos, Diego's men appearing from everywhere, phone calls being made, weapons being checked with practiced efficiency that spoke of this not being the first time they had mobilized for war. Diego kept one arm around me as he issued orders, his voice never rising, but carrying authority that had grown men moving without question. They want a trade, he said to someone I could not see through my tears. Me for the boy. Tell them I agree to meet in 2 hours at the warehouse district. No, I said, grabbing his jacket. You cannot. They will kill you. They will try, Diego agreed. But I am very hard to kill Luna. And your son is innocent in all this. He should never have been dragged into my world. This is my mistake to fix. A older man appeared, someone I recognized from earlier in the evening, and he spoke urgently to Diego in Spanish, too fast for me to follow. Diego listened, nodded, then turned back to me. Luna, I need you to stay here where you are safe. My men will protect you while I go get Marco. I am coming with you, I said. my voice stronger than I felt, my terror transforming into something fierce and focused. He is my son, and I am not staying behind. Diego looked like he wanted to argue, but something in my face must have convinced him because he nodded once. You stay in the car, he said. You do not get out no matter what you see or hear. Do you understand me, Luna? I cannot focus on getting Marco out if I am worried about keeping you safe too. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and he kissed my forehead hard before pulling me toward the exit, where cars were already waiting, engines running, armed men climbing into vehicles with the practiced efficiency of soldiers going to battle. The drive through the city felt both endless and too fast, Diego making phone calls and receiving updates while his hands stayed locked with mine. His grip, the only thing keeping me tethered to reality, while my mind conjured horrible images of Marco, scared and crying and calling for me. This is my fault, Diego said quietly between calls. I brought you into my world, and I did not protect what mattered most. If anything happens to him, Luna, I will never forgive myself. Just get him back, I whispered. Just bring my baby home, and we will figure out everything else after. The warehouse district was exactly what it sounded like. Miles of abandoned industrial buildings, and empty lots where streetlights were broken more often than working, where the only sounds were rats and distant sirens and the wind rattling chain-link fences. Diego's convoy pulled up 3 blocks away from the target building, and he turned to me with an expression that brooked no argument. You stay here with Vincent, doors locked, engine running. If anything goes wrong, he drives you straight to the police station and you tell them everything. I wanted to argue, but my throat was too tight with fear to form words, so I just nodded and watched him check his weapon with movements so practiced they looked like a dance. He kissed me once, hard and desperate. Then he was gone into the darkness with a dozen men who moved like shadows, and I was alone in the back of the SUV with Vincent's eyes watching me in the rearview mirror. I pulled out the rosary that grandmother had given me when I made my first communion, the beads worn smooth from her prayers, and now mine. And I whispered words I had not said in years, bargaining with God and the universe and anyone who might be listening, that I would do anything, give anything, if they would just let Marco come back to me safe. The minutes crawled by like hours, and I could see the warehouse in the distance, could see the faint glow of lights inside. And then I heard it. Gunfire, rapid and sharp, echoing through the empty streets like fireworks. My hands clenched around the rosary hard enough that the beads cut into my palms, and I tasted blood where I had bitten my lip without realizing it. More gunfire, then silence that was somehow worse, and I found myself praying faster, the words tumbling over each other in Spanish and English all mixed together. Vincent's radio crackled with voices speaking rapidly, and I saw his shoulders relax slightly, which I took as a good sign even though I could not understand what was being said. Movement at the warehouse entrance, figures emerging, and my heart stopped when I saw Diego's silhouette, unmistakable even in the darkness, and in his arms was something small, and I was out of the car before Vincent could stop me, running in heels across broken pavement toward my son. Marco, I screamed, and I saw his head lift, saw him start crying and reaching for me. Diego broke into a run despite whatever he was carrying, and when we met halfway, I grabbed Marco from his arms and sank to my knees, clutching my baby against my chest while sobs racked through me so hard I could barely breathe. Mama, Marco cried into my neck, his small body shaking. They were mean, but Mr. Diego came and saved me. He was like a superhero, Mama. He fought the bad men and he carried me out. I looked up at Diego through my tears and saw that his shirt was torn, that dark stains were spreading across the white fabric, that he was bleeding from somewhere but still standing, still watching us with an expression so fierce and protective it made my chest ache. Thank you, I managed to say, the words completely inadequate for what he had just done. Thank you, thank you. I told you, he said, kneeling beside us, despite what must have been significant pain, his hand coming up to cup the back of Marco's head with surprising gentleness. I protect what is mine. Around us, his men were securing the area, vehicles pulling up, but I only had eyes for Diego, for the blood soaking through his shirt, for the way he was looking at Marco and me, like we were something precious he had almost lost. "You are hurt," I said, reaching toward the blood, and he caught my hand. "It is nothing," he said, but his voice was tight with pain. "The important thing is Marco is safe. They will never touch him again, Luna. I made sure of that." The way he said it made clear what had happened to the men who took my son, and I should have been horrified, should have been disgusted by the violence, but all I felt was fierce gratitude and something deeper, something that felt dangerously like love for this man who had walked into a building full of armed enemies to save a child who was not even his. Rain started falling then, soft at first, then harder, and Diego helped me to my feet, keeping one arm around us both as we hurried back to the vehicles, and I realized that somewhere in the chaos and terror and relief, my walls had come down completely, that I was his now in every way that mattered, and the knowledge did not frighten me the way it should have. Marco fell asleep almost immediately once we got him home, exhausted from terror and relief, and Carmen sat with him while a doctor Diego had summoned examined him for injuries and pronounced him miraculously unharmed, except for some bruises. I stayed until his breathing evened out into the deep rhythm of sleep, until I was certain he was truly safe. And then I found myself walking down the hallway toward Diego's room without consciously deciding to go there, drawn by something I could not name or resist. I pushed open the door without knocking and found him sitting on the edge of his bed, while a doctor worked on a wound in his side, the same doctor who had seen Marco, and Diego's face was tight with controlled pain as the man stitched torn flesh. "I can finish this," I heard myself say, moving into the room, my voice steadier than I felt. "I have medical training from when I worked at a clinic before Marco was born. I can take care of him." The doctor looked to Diego for confirmation, and when he nodded, the man packed up his supplies and left, closing the door softly behind him. I moved to where Diego sat, taking in the extent of the damage now that his shirt was completely off. The bullet graze along his ribs that was still seeping blood despite the butterfly bandages the doctor had applied, the bruises already forming across his chest and shoulder, the evidence of violence done and received. "You could have died," I said, my hands shaking as I picked up the gauze and antiseptic, sitting beside him on the bed close enough that our knees touched. "You walked into that warehouse knowing they might kill you, and you did it anyway." Diego's hand caught my wrist gently, stilling my trembling fingers. "And I would do it again," he said, his voice rough but certain. "For him. For you. I would walk into hell itself, Luna." "Why?" I whispered, needing to hear him say it, needing the words even though I could see the truth written in his eyes. "Why would you risk everything for us?" "You know why," he said, his free hand coming up to cup my face. "You have known since that first night, when I heard you singing, and something in me recognized something in you. I love you, Luna. I have loved you from the beginning." The words broke something open inside me, some last wall I had been clinging to, and suddenly I was crying. Great gasping sobs that shook my whole body as all the terror and relief and exhaustion of the night crashed over me like a wave. Diego pulled me against his chest despite his injuries, his arms coming around me strong and sure, and he let me fall apart while the rain drummed against the windows and his blood stained my dress. "I love you too," I managed to say between sobs. "God help me. I love you, Diego. I do not know when it happened or how, but I do. I love you, and it terrifies me." His lips found my forehead, my temple, my cheek, kisses that were gentle despite the passion I could feel thrumming through his body. "Do not be terrified," he murmured against my skin. "Be certain, be fierce, be mine, Luna, fully and completely. No more barriers, no more fear." I pulled back enough to look at his face, at the man who had killed for me tonight, who had bled for my son, who looked at me like I was something precious instead of broken. "I am yours," I said, and felt the truth of it settle into my bones. I choose this. I choose you. I choose us. Diego's mouth found mine then, and the kiss was nothing like the gentle touches from before. It was desperate and claiming and full of everything we had been holding back, and when he pulled me onto his lap despite his wound, I went willingly, my hands tangling in his hair while his found the zipper of my dress. "We should not," I started. "You are hurt," but he silenced me with another kiss. "I need you," he said against my lips. "I need to feel you alive and mine. I need to know this is real." I let my dress fall away, let him lay me back on his bed among the blood-stained clothes and medical supplies. And when he moved over me, I saw love and possession and promise in his eyes. And for the first time since walking into his office that night, I felt no fear, only certainty that this was exactly where I was meant to be. I woke to sunlight streaming through windows I now recognized, to sheets that smelled like Diego and me tangled together, to the sensation of being watched. And when I opened my eyes, I found him propped on one elbow beside me, his dark gaze tracing my face like he was memorizing every detail. "How long have you been awake?" I asked, my voice rough from sleep and from the crying I had done last night before we had fallen into each other with desperate need. "Hours," he admitted, his finger coming up to trace the line of my jaw, my cheekbone, the curve of my lips. "I have been watching you sleep and trying to convince myself this is real, that you are truly here in my bed, that you are mine." I reached for him, my hand finding the bandage on his ribs, checking for fresh blood and finding none. "How do you feel?" I asked, and he caught my hand and brought it to his lips. "Better than I have felt in 10 years, he said, kissing each of my knuckles, complete in a way I did not know I was missing, until you walked into my life, singing a song my mother loved. The morning light made everything feel softer, more possible, and I realized that the fear that had been my constant companion, since entering his world, had transformed into something else, into certainty and peace and belonging. "We need to talk about the future," Diego said, shifting so he could look at me properly. "About what comes next now that you have chosen this life, now that everyone knows you are mine." He reached across me to the nightstand and picked up his phone, pulling up something and showing me the screen. "Your grandmother was moved to a private care facility last night," he said, "the best in the state. She has around-the-clock nursing care and her own suite. I have already arranged for Marco to start at a private school with security provided, and this house is yours, Luna. Your home now, not just a place you are staying." I stared at the photos on his phone, at grandmother's new room that looked more like a luxury hotel than a medical facility, at documents showing enrollment at a school I could never have afforded. "You planned all this," I said. "Not quite a question. You have been planning this since the beginning." "Since the moment I heard you sing," he confirmed, putting the phone aside and pulling me closer despite the protest of his injured ribs. "I knew then that you were going to be my wife, Luna. I knew that I would do whatever it took to make you mine. The only question was how long it would take you to accept what we both wanted." His arrogance should have annoyed me, but instead I felt something warm bloom in my chest because he was right. I had wanted this even when I was fighting it, had been drawn to him from that first night in ways I did not want to examine. "Marry me," he said, and it came out half command, half plea, his hand cupping my face with a gentleness that made my breath catch. "You are supposed to ask, not command," I said, but I was smiling, feeling lighter than I had in years, maybe lighter than I had ever felt in my adult life. Diego's mouth curved into a real smile, the kind that transformed his whole face and made him look younger, less burdened. "I am asking Luna Vega," he said, each word deliberate. "Will you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Of standing at my side? Of building a life with me? Of letting me love you and Marco and give you everything you have ever deserved?" The answer was easier than it should have been. Easier than saying yes to a man I had known for less than a week. Easier than agreeing to marry into a world of violence and power and danger. "Yes," I said, and watched joy flash across his face like lightning. Yes, Diego, I will marry you. He kissed me then, deep and possessive, and when we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard. I have something for you, he said, reaching into the nightstand drawer and pulling out a small velvet box that made my heart skip. This was my grandmother's. She gave it to my mother, and my mother wanted me to give it to the woman I would marry. I have been carrying it since the day after we met. Inside was a ring that took my breath away, an emerald surrounded by diamonds that caught the morning light and threw green fire across the white sheets. And when he slid it onto my finger, it fit perfectly, like it had been made for me, like everything in his world had been waiting for me to arrive and claim my place. The family gathering was held at a compound even larger than Diego's estate, a sprawling property that had belonged to the Torres family for 3 generations, and as we drove through the gates with Marco chattering excitedly in the back seat, I felt Diego's hand tighten on mine. They will test you, he said quietly, his uncle especially. He has never approved of my choices, and he will want to see if you are strong enough for this life. But you have already proven yourself, Luna. Just be who you are. The courtyard was filled with people when we arrived, dozens of them, ranging from elderly women in traditional dresses to young men who watched our car with the alert wariness of soldiers, and children ran between the adults, playing games that seemed universal across cultures. Music played from somewhere, Colombian folk songs that reminded me of my mother and grandmother, and the smell of cooking meat and spices filled the air, making my stomach rumble despite my nervousness. Diego helped me from the car, his hand possessive on my lower back, and Marco immediately ran toward a group of children who welcomed him with the easy acceptance of the young. An older man approached us, perhaps in his 60s, with silver hair and Diego's same dark eyes, and I knew without being told that this was the uncle, the one who would judge whether I was worthy. Tío Miguel, Diego said, formal and respectful in a way I had not heard from him before. I would like you to meet my fiancée, Luna Vega, and her son Marco. Miguel's gaze swept over me, assessing everything from my simple dress to the way I stood to the engagement ring on my finger, and I forced myself to meet his eyes without flinching, to stand tall despite every instinct screaming that I was out of my depth. So you are the woman who has finally captured my nephew's attention, Miguel said in Spanish, his accent thicker than Diego's. The cleaning woman who stopped him from killing Rafael Mendoza with her bare hands on his throat. I responded in Spanish, letting him hear my Colombian roots in my accent. I am a woman who does not believe in unnecessary violence, but I am also a woman who will do whatever is necessary to protect the people I love. Your nephew has shown me and my son nothing but care and protection. I hope to honor his family and his mother's memory by standing at his side. Something shifted in Miguel's expression, not quite approval, but close, and he nodded slowly. She has strength, he said to Diego, switching to English, more than the last woman you brought around. What was her name? The model who fainted when she saw Vicente cleaning his gun? Your mother would approve of this one, I think. Other family members approached then, a stream of aunts and uncles and cousins, all wanting to meet the woman who had changed Diego, and I shook hands and accepted kisses on my cheek and tried to remember names while Diego's pride radiated from him like heat. An elderly woman pulled me aside at one point, Diego's grandmother, I learned, and she held my hands in hers that were gnarled with age, but still strong. You survived the kidnapping of your son, she said in Spanish. You watched Diego almost kill a man for insulting you. You calmed his rage when no one else could. These things tell me you are stronger than you know, mija. This family needs strength, not weakness. The gathering moved to long tables set up under trees strung with lights, and food appeared in quantities that seemed impossible. Traditional Colombian dishes that made me think of my mother's kitchen, of Sunday dinners before cancer took her. I sat at Diego's side and watched Marco play with his new cousins, watched Diego laugh with his uncles and tease his younger cousins, and I realized this was not just a criminal organization, it was a family in the truest sense, bound by blood and loyalty and shared history. By the time the sun set and the children were falling asleep on their parents' laps, I felt something settle inside me, an acceptance that I belonged here now, that these dangerous, complicated people were my people, and that the protection Diego had promised extended far beyond just him. It came with an entire family who would now stand between me and anyone who wished us harm. The wedding planner spread fabric samples across the dining room table while I tried to focus on the difference between ivory and champagne silk, but my attention kept drifting to Diego's study, where he had been locked in meetings all morning with men whose faces I was learning to read for signs of trouble. Carmen sat with me offering opinions on flowers and cake flavors, and Marco colored pictures of what he thought the wedding should look like, all dinosaurs and superheroes mixed with flowers. The study door opened, and Diego emerged with an expression that made my stomach drop. The careful blankness that I had learned meant something was very wrong. "Can you give us a moment?" he said to the wedding planner, who gathered her samples with practiced efficiency and left with a promise to return tomorrow. Diego waited until we were alone except for Carmen and Marco before speaking. "We need to postpone the wedding," he said without preamble. "I have received intelligence that Rafael Mendoza is planning something for the ceremony. He sees it as an opportunity when my attention will be divided, when there will be too many civilians present for me to respond with appropriate force." "No," I said, standing up from the table, surprising myself with the strength in my voice. "We are not postponing. We are not letting that man dictate our lives or steal our happiness." Diego crossed to me, his hands on my shoulders, his eyes searching mine. "Luna, you do not understand what he is capable of, what could happen if he decides to strike during the ceremony. I cannot protect you and all our guests if he brings enough men. I will not risk your life or Marco's for one day." "Then we make sure he cannot strike," I said, an idea forming even as I spoke. "We increase security, we change venues to somewhere more defensible. We limit the guest list to only family and people you trust completely. We turn our wedding into a fortress if we have to. But we do not let him win. We do not show fear." Carmen made a sound that might have been approval, and Diego stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "You understand what you are asking," he said slowly. "You are asking to plan a wedding that is also a potential battleground. You are choosing to go forward knowing that violence might come to our door on what should be the happiest day of our lives." "I understand exactly what I am asking," I replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I am all in, Diego. I chose this world and I chose you, and I will not let men like Rafael Mendoza make me afraid to celebrate that choice. So either we plan this wedding properly, or I will do it myself." Something like wonder crossed his face, and he pulled me against his chest, despite Carmen and Marco watching. "You are remarkable," he murmured into my hair. "My mother would have loved you. She had the same fire, this refusal to be cowed by the darkness of our world." "Then let us honor her memory by refusing to hide," I said, stepping back and turning to Carmen. "We will need the wedding at the estate instead of the church. We need sightlines and controlled access points. We need every security measure Diego's men can think of, while still making it beautiful for our families." The next 3 weeks became a strange dance of planning beauty and preparing for war, wedding dresses and bulletproof vests occupying the same conversations, flower arrangements and sniper positions being discussed over morning coffee. I sat in on security meetings with Diego's men and learned the layout of the estate in terms of defensive positions and escape routes, learned which windows had the best views and which were most vulnerable, learned to think like someone who expected violence instead of someone who hoped for peace. Marco thought it was all a grand adventure. The extra guards who played with him, the excitement in the air, the way everyone treated our upcoming wedding like the most important event in the world. Diego watched me transform from the frightened woman who had stumbled into his world into someone who could plan table arrangements with the wedding coordinator in the morning and review security protocols with his head of operations in the afternoon. and I could see in his eyes that I had finally become what he saw in me that first night. A queen who could stand beside a king in a kingdom built on danger and love in equal measure. The women gathered in the estate's spa wing the night before the wedding. Diego's aunts and cousins and grandmother, along with Carmen, who had become something like a mother to me in the weeks since I had entered this world. They brought champagne and traditional Colombian music and stories that made me laugh until my sides ached. Stories of Diego as a serious child who never smiled, of his transformation after his parents died into something cold and unreachable. He was so young when he took over, Diego's Aunt Sophia said, her eyes distant with memory, only 24 and suddenly responsible for everything, for hundreds of people depending on him for their livelihood and protection. He stopped laughing that year, stopped letting anyone close. I sipped my champagne and felt their eyes on me, assessing but warm now in a way they had not been at the family gathering. "You have changed him," his grandmother said, reaching across to pat my hand with her gnarled fingers. "He smiles now, he plays with your son. He talks about a future beyond just survival and revenge. This is your gift to him, Luna. You have given him back his humanity." Carmen refilled my glass and settled beside me on the plush couch. "Love in our world is dangerous," she said quietly, "because it gives our enemies a target, because caring about someone makes you vulnerable in ways that money and guns cannot protect against. But it is also the only thing worth fighting for, the only thing that makes all the violence and fear worthwhile." The other women nodded in agreement, and I realized they all knew this truth intimately, had all loved men who lived in danger, had all made the choice I was making to bind themselves to someone whose world was built on sand and blood. "Tomorrow you become family," Sophia said, raising her glass. "You become one of us completely. And that means we protect you just as fiercely as Diego does. It means you are never alone, Luna, no matter what comes." Across the city in Diego's private club, he sat surrounded by his most trusted men, the inner circle who had been with him since he took over from his father, and they raised glasses of whiskey to toast his last night as a single man. "She makes you better, Jefe," his second-in-command Vicente said. "The coldness that worried us after your father died, it is melting. We have our brother back, instead of just our boss." Diego stared into his glass and thought about the woman who had walked into his office singing a song his mother loved, who had refused his money out of pride, who had stopped him from killing Raphael with just her voice and her hand on his arm. "I did not think I could feel this way again," he admitted to the men who had seen him at his worst. "After my parents, I thought love was a weakness I could not afford. But Luna, she is not a weakness. She is my strength." His men exchanged glances that held approval and something like relief, because they had watched him become harder with each year, watched him sacrifice pieces of his humanity on the altar of power and protection, and they had worried that one day there would be nothing left of the boy they remembered. "Raphael will come tomorrow," Vicente said, stating what they all knew. "He cannot let this wedding happen without trying to hurt you. He sees Luna as your weakness, and he will try to exploit it." "Let him come," Diego replied, his voice hard as stone, his hand tightening on his glass. "Let him try to touch what is mine, and he will learn exactly why I have held this territory for 10 years, why men twice my age fear to speak my name. I have been patient with Raphael out of respect for old alliances, but if he threatens my wedding, if he threatens Luna or Marco, I will end him and anyone who stands with him." The men nodded, understanding that this was not anger speaking, but cold calculation, that Diego had already planned for every contingency, that tomorrow's wedding would be beautiful and deadly in equal measure, and that the woman waiting at the estate had earned their loyalty, not just because their boss loved her, but because she had proven herself worthy of standing beside him. The morning of the wedding arrived with clear skies and cool October air that smelled of flowers and possibility, and I stood in my room while Carmen and Sophia helped me into a dress that made me look like someone from a fairy tale, all white silk and delicate lace, that had been handmade by Colombian artisans Diego had flown in specifically for this purpose. The emerald and diamond necklace that had been his mother's sat heavy and precious against my throat, and when I looked in the mirror, I saw not the exhausted janitor who had stumbled into Diego Torres's office, but a woman who had been transformed by love and choice into something stronger, something worthy of the life I was about to claim. Marco burst into the room wearing his small tuxedo and nearly knocked me over with his excitement, his hair slicked back and his face scrubbed clean. "Mama, you look like a princess," he said. "And Mr. Diego is waiting at the chapel, and he looks really nervous. Is he scared?" "Not scared," I told my son, kneeling down to his level and straightening his little bow tie. "Just happy. The same way I am happy. Are you ready to be our ring bearer like we practiced?" "Can I call him Dad after today?" Marco asked, his expression serious in that way children get when something matters to them deeply. "Because he takes care of us like a dad should, and I really want to have a dad." Tears burned behind my eyes, but I blinked them back and kissed his forehead. "You can call him whatever feels right in your heart," I said, "and I think he would love nothing more than to hear you call him Dad." The chapel Diego had built on the estate grounds was small and intimate, designed to hold maybe 100 people, and every seat was filled with family and the trusted inner circle who served as both guests and security. Flowers covered every surface, white roses and lilies and orchids that filled the air with their perfume, and candles flickered in holders along the walls, casting everything in warm, golden light. I stood at the entrance with Miguel, who had agreed to walk me down the aisle since my father was not alive to do it, and I could see Diego standing at the altar in a black tuxedo that made him look like he had stepped out of a movie, but it was his face that made my breath catch, the raw emotion written across features that were usually so controlled. Marco walked ahead of us, carrying the rings on a small pillow, and when he reached Diego, I saw my son whisper something that made Diego's eyes go wide and bright, before he crouched down and pulled Marco into a fierce hug. Then the music changed and I started walking, every eye turning to watch, and I only had eyes for Diego, who was openly crying now, tears streaming down his face as he watched me come to him. I had never seen him cry before, had seen him angry and tender and dangerous, but never this vulnerable, and it made my own tears spill over to see this powerful man, undone by the sight of me in a wedding dress. When I reached him, he took both my hands in his, gripping them like I might disappear if he let go, and the priest began speaking words in Spanish and English about love and commitment and the sacred bond of marriage. The vows Diego had written himself, and when it was his turn to speak, his voice was rough with emotion, but steady. "You walked into my office, singing a song from my past, and gave me a future," he said, each word weighted with meaning. "When I had forgotten how to hope, you reminded me. When I had become only hard edges and cold calculation, you showed me that strength could be gentle, and that love was not weakness, but the greatest courage. Everything I am, everything I have, is yours, Luna, from this day until my last breath." I could barely see him through my tears, but I managed to speak my own vows. "You saw me when I was invisible," I said, my voice breaking but determined. "When I was drowning, you offered me not just rescue but partnership. You gave me and my son a home when we were lost. You protected us when we were vulnerable. You loved me when I did not believe I was worthy of love. I am yours completely, Diego. In this world and whatever comes after." The priest pronounced us husband and wife, and Diego pulled me against him and kissed me like we were the only two people in existence, and I heard cheering and music and celebration erupting around us, but all I felt was complete, finally and truly home, in a way I had not been since my mother died. The reception was in full swing, music and laughter filling the ballroom that had been decorated with thousands of flowers and lights that made everything look magical, and I was dancing with Diego while Marco spun in circles with his new cousins nearby when the lights went out with a suddenness that made my heart stop. Gunfire erupted outside, rapid and close, the sound of automatic weapons that I had learned to recognize during my weeks in Diego's world, and suddenly everyone was moving. With practiced efficiency that spoke of plans made and drilled for exactly this scenario. "Down," Diego commanded, pulling me to the floor and covering my body with his while around us guests, who I had thought were just family, pulled weapons from beneath elegant dresses and tailored suits. "Marco!" I gasped, trying to see my son in the darkness lit only by emergency lights that had kicked in. "Where is Marco?" "Carmen has him," Diego said, his voice deadly calm, even as more gunfire sounded closer now. "She is taking him and your grandmother to the safe room. You need to go with them, Luna. Right now." He pulled me to my feet and practically threw me at Vicente, who appeared from the darkness like a ghost, his weapon already drawn. "Get her to safety," Diego ordered. Then to me as Vicente started pulling me toward a hidden door I had not known existed. "Stay there until I come for you. Do not open that door for anyone else, do you understand?" "I am not leaving you," I started. But he cut me off with a kiss that tasted like desperation and fury. "I am ending this tonight," he said against my lips. "Raphael has made his last mistake by coming here. By threatening you and our family on our wedding day. Stay in that safe room and trust me, Luna. Trust that I will come back to you." "Come back to me," I said, gripping his jacket. "Please, Diego, come back." "Always," he promised. Then he was gone into the chaos, shouting orders in Spanish while his men moved like a well-oiled machine, and Vicente was pulling me through the hidden door that led down concrete steps into what looked like a bunker beneath the estate. Carmen waited there with Marco clutched against her chest, his face buried in her shoulder, and grandmother sat in a wheelchair looking surprisingly calm for a woman whose granddaughter's wedding reception had just turned into a war zone. The walls were thick concrete and the door was steel, and through monitors mounted on one wall, I could see what was happening above us, could see Diego's men engaging with attackers who had breached the perimeter, could see muzzle flashes and bodies falling, and my husband moving through it all with lethal grace. "He has been preparing for this," Carmen said, following my gaze to the monitors. "Since the moment he decided to marry you, he knew Raphael would try something. Every person at that reception is armed and trained. Every inch of this estate has been fortified. Raphael thought your wedding would make Diego vulnerable, but it has done the opposite. It has unified all the allied families against a common threat." On the screens, I watched Diego coordinate his men with hand signals and short commands. Watched him move with the controlled violence of someone who had been doing this since he was barely more than a boy, and I understood that this was who he truly was, not just the man who had been gentle with my son and patient with my fears, but also the killer who had built an empire on the graves of his enemies. The gunfire intensified then, decreased, and I could see on the monitors that Diego's men were pushing the attackers back, that bodies in black tactical gear littered the grounds, while Diego's forces remained largely intact. Raphael had underestimated what he was up against, had thought that attacking a wedding would catch them unprepared, but he had not understood that Diego Torres protected what was his, with a ruthlessness that made other men's violence look like children playing at war. The gunfire stopped after what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, and through the monitors I watched Diego's men securing the perimeter, dragging wounded attackers into zip ties while medics tended to the few casualties on our side. Diego stood in the center of the courtyard, his tuxedo jacket gone and his white shirt stained with blood and dirt, and he was dragging someone by the collar toward the fountain where lights had been restored. Rafael Mendoza looked nothing like the confident man who had insulted me at that first event. His face was bloody, and one arm hung at an odd angle, and he was on his knees before Diego while armed men formed a circle around them. I could not hear what they were saying, but I could read the body language, could see Raphael's defeat and Diego's cold fury, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was watching a man's last moments. Luna. No, Carmen said as I moved toward the door. You should not see this. You should not be part of what comes next. But I was already punching in the code Diego had made me memorize, already pushing through the steel door because whatever happened next I needed Diego to know I was there, that I saw him completely and loved him anyway. The cool dawn air hit my face as I emerged from the bunker entrance hidden behind landscaping, and I moved through the aftermath of battle toward where my husband stood over the man who had tried to destroy our wedding. Diego's hand was on his weapon, and I could see the war in his shoulders, the tension that said he was seconds away from pulling the trigger and ending this permanently. You have gone soft, Diego, Raphael said through broken teeth, his voice mocking despite his situation. The Diego Torres I knew would have killed me the moment I stepped foot on his property. But you hesitate now. She has made you weak. No, Diego said, and his voice carried across the courtyard. I have found something worth being better for, worth building a future instead of just surviving the past. He holstered his weapon and I saw shock ripple through the assembled men. You are leaving this country, Raphael, Diego continued, tonight, on a plane that will take you somewhere you can never return from, and if you or anyone connected to you ever steps foot in my territory again, if you ever speak my wife's name, or think about my family, I will find you, and I will finish what I showed mercy on today. Raphael stared up at him with something like disbelief. You are letting me live. I am letting you go into exile, Diego corrected, because my wife has taught me that not every threat requires death, that there are other ways to protect what is mine. But make no mistake, Raphael, this is mercy you do not deserve and will never receive again. I moved closer then, stepping into the circle of armed men, and Diego turned to find me there in my wedding dress, now stained with dust from the bunker. You chose mercy, I said, proud and amazed and falling in love with him all over again. You taught me it was possible, he replied, pulling me against his side despite the blood and dirt covering him. You taught me that strength does not always have to look like violence, that sometimes the harder choice is to let someone live with their defeat. Raphael was pulled to his feet by Vicente and two other men, and as they dragged him toward a waiting vehicle, he looked back at us once. She has changed you, he said, and it was not clear if he meant it as insult or observation. Yes, Diego agreed, and I am grateful for it every day. The sun was rising over the estate grounds, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and around us, Diego's men began the work of cleaning up the aftermath, of tending to wounded and removing bodies and restoring order to chaos. This is the last time, Diego said quietly, meant only for me. I am done with this life, Luna. Done with the violence and the constant threat. I have been working for months to transition our operations into legitimate businesses. To build something Marco can be proud of instead of ashamed. Raphael was the last of the old guard who would challenge me, and now he is gone. What will you do? I asked, leaning into his warmth and strength. What does Diego Torres look like without an empire built on fear? He looked down at me with eyes that held hope I had never seen there before. Like a man who owns hotels and restaurants and real estate, he said. Like a father who goes to his son's school plays, and a husband who comes home every night to his wife. Like someone who honors his parents' memory by building something that lasts, instead of just surviving. 3 days after the wedding, after Raphael had been put on a plane and the estate had been restored to its usual pristine condition, Diego surprised me by saying we were taking a trip, just the three of us, to Colombia. We flew on a private jet that made Marco's eyes go wide with wonder. And when we landed in Cali, he rented a car and drove us himself into the mountains, winding up narrow roads that climbed higher and higher until my ears popped and the air grew thin and cool. This is where both our mothers came from, he said, as we rounded a curve and a small village appeared before us. clinging to the mountainside like it had grown there organically, stone houses with red tile roofs and narrow streets that wound between them. This is where their families lived before they came to America, looking for better lives. The village was called San Miguel de las Flores, and it looked like time had stopped there 50 years ago. Chickens wandering freely, and old women sitting in doorways watching the world pass, and children playing in a dusty square around a fountain that no longer worked. Diego parked in the square and people emerged from their houses, and I watched recognition dawn on weathered faces as they saw him, as they realized who had come back to the place his mother had left. Don Dieguito, an elderly man said, coming forward with arms outstretched, "You have returned to us. It has been so many years." We walked through the village with Marco between us holding both our hands, and Diego explained that he had been sending money here for years, had funded the new school and the medical clinic and the water system that brought clean water down from the mountain, but he had not visited since his mother's funeral when he was barely old enough to understand what he had lost. The church sat at the highest point of the village, small and whitewashed, with a bell tower that looked ready to collapse, and Diego led us inside where it was cool and dim and smelled of old incense and stone. "My mother sang here every Sunday," he said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "She had the most beautiful voice. Everyone in the village would come just to hear her sing." "My mother sang here too," I said, realization dawning. My grandmother told me stories about the little church in the mountains, where the women sang while they made lace, and the men worked the coffee fields. We stood in that ancient church, and I understood why that song had connected us, why hearing me sing it had reached through Diego's defenses to touch something he thought he had lost. Because our mothers had stood in this same space and raised their voices together before life had scattered them to different fates. "Sing it," Diego said, his hand finding mine. "Sing it for them, Luna, for both our mothers and all the women who came before." So I sang, my voice filling the small church with the melody my mother had taught me, and after the first verse Diego joined me, his voice rough but true, and then Marco's high, clear voice joined ours, and we sang together as a family, in a church that had heard generations of voices raised in prayer and celebration and sorrow. "Are we a real family now?" Marco asked when the last note faded into the stones, looking between Diego and me with serious eyes. "Yes," we said together, Diego's arm coming around my shoulders and pulling us both close. "Yes, we are a real family, now and always." Later, Diego showed me the plans he had for the village, a cooperative that would help the coffee farmers get fair prices for their crops, a foundation that would provide scholarships for children to attend university, investments that would bring jobs without destroying the traditional way of life. "Luna will run the education programs," he said, introducing me to the village elders who had gathered in the square. "She will make sure your children have opportunities our mothers never had." I spent the next week in that mountain village learning the names of children who reminded me of Marco, of women who reminded me of my grandmother, of men who had known Diego's grandfather and my great-uncle, and I understood that we were using the wealth Diego had built not just to protect ourselves, but to give back to the place that had given us our roots, to honor the past while building toward a future where children did not have to leave their homes to find success. 6 months after the wedding, I woke to morning sickness that sent me running to the bathroom, and when I emerged, Diego was standing there with crackers and ginger tea and a smile so bright it made my heart ache. "I hoped it was this," he said, pulling me into his arms despite my protests that I was disgusting. "I have been watching you for signs, waiting." We told Marco over breakfast, and he spent the entire meal talking to my still flat stomach about all the things he would teach his little brother or sister. And when Diego drove him to school later, I watched from the window and saw my son throw his arms around Diego's neck and heard him yell, "I love you, Dad," loud enough that other parents turned to look. Marco had transformed in the months since the wedding. From a quiet boy who worried about his sick grandmother and his exhausted mother, to a confident child who excelled at his new school and came home every day with stories about friends and teachers, and field trips to museums I could never have afforded. Grandmother had moved from the care facility to a cottage on the estate grounds, her health stabilizing now that she received proper treatment and was not stressed about money or survival. And she spent her days teaching Marco to cook traditional recipes and telling him stories about his great-grandparents and the mountains where they had lived. I ran the foundation Diego had created, spending my mornings in an office that overlooked the gardens where I had first learned to breathe in this new life, reviewing scholarship applications and organizing programs that would help other struggling families find stability the way we had found it. Diego was home most nights now, arriving in time for family dinners where we sat around the kitchen table instead of the formal dining room, where Marco chattered about his day and grandmother told stories, and Diego held my hand under the table like he was afraid I might disappear if he let go. He had stepped back from the day-to-day operations of what remained of the organization, appointing trusted people to handle what could not yet be fully legitimized, while he focused on building legitimate businesses that would support the family for generations. He met regularly with young men from the neighborhoods where he had grown up, offering them jobs and mentorship, and a path that did not involve violence and early death, trying to give back what the streets had taken from him. The estate felt different now, less like a fortress, and more like a home, with toys scattered in the living room and Marco's artwork on the refrigerator and grandmother's telenovelas playing in the cottage most afternoons. Security was still present but reduced, watchful but not oppressive, because the wedding and Raphael's defeat had sent a message through Diego's world that he was no longer just powerful but also willing to show mercy, that his family was off limits and anyone who threatened them would face consequences, but also that he was done with unnecessary conflict. "Sometimes I think about that night," I said one evening as we sat on the balcony off our bedroom, watching the sun set over the grounds, cleaning your office, singing that song, not knowing you were there listening. Diego pulled me closer against his side, his hand resting on my stomach where our child grew. "I think about it every day," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "The night my life began. The night I heard a woman singing a song I thought I had lost forever and knew that everything was about to change. We had come so far from that first meeting, from the janitor and the mafia boss to husband and wife, to partners building something real and lasting from the ashes of our separate traumas. I would not change anything," I said, "even the fear, even the danger, even Raphael's attack on our wedding, because it all led to this, to us, to this family we have built." "Neither would I," Diego agreed, kissing my temple. "You saved me, Luna. You and Marco. You reminded me that there was more to life than power and revenge, that love was not weakness but the greatest strength of all." Evening light filtered through the kitchen windows, painting everything gold and warm, and I stood at the sink humming that old song while I rinsed vegetables for dinner, my hand moving in unconscious rhythm while the other rested on my growing belly where our daughter moved and kicked. I had not meant to start singing out loud, but the melody came naturally now, no longer a source of pain or longing, but a celebration of where I had come from and where I had arrived. And I did not hear Diego enter until Marco's delighted squeal made me turn to find my husband, standing in the doorway, with our son perched on his shoulders. "Mama is singing the Abuela song," Marco announced, bouncing with excitement. "The one from the mountains. Can you teach me all the words, Mama? I only remember the first part." "Your Abuela would love that," I said, wiping my hands on a towel and moving toward them. "She has been asking when you want to learn the harmony." Diego lifted Marco down, and our son immediately started dancing around the kitchen the way I had danced with my mop that first night, unself-conscious and full of joy. And Diego crossed to me and pulled me into his arms, despite my protests about being covered in flour from the arepas I had been making. "She would love all of this," Diego said softly, looking around the kitchen that was nothing like his formal dining room or his expensive office. "This warmth and laughter and normalcy, this is what she wanted for me, Luna. What she died hoping I would find. He rested his hand over mine on my stomach, and I felt our daughter kick against our joined palms, this new life we were creating together. "Dance with us," Marco demanded, pulling on Diego's sleeve, all three of us together like at the wedding. So we danced in the kitchen with flour on the counter and vegetables half chopped, and dinner only halfway prepared. The three of us moving to music that played from the speaker on the counter, mixed with my singing and Marco's laughter, and Diego's deep voice joining in on the chorus. Through the window I could see the gardens lit by the setting sun, could see grandmother's cottage where warm light glowed, could see the life we had built from a chance encounter, and a song that had connected two broken people and made them whole. I looked up and found Diego watching me with an expression I recognized. The same wonder and hunger and possessiveness he had worn that first night when I had stumbled into his office singing. But now, there was something else there too. Contentment and peace, and the security of knowing I was his by choice, not circumstance. "What are you thinking?" I asked, reading the emotion in his eyes. "That I would live that night 1,000 times over if it meant finding you," he said, pulling me closer. "That hearing you sing changed everything. That you are the best mistake I ever made." "I was never a mistake," I corrected, standing on tiptoe to kiss him while Marco made exaggerated gagging sounds. "I was exactly what you needed, what we both needed." "You are right," Diego agreed, and his smile was genuine and unguarded in a way that still surprised me sometimes. "You were fate dressed as a janitor with a mop and a song, and I am grateful every single day that you walked through my door." Marco tugged on both our hands, demanding we keep dancing, and as we spun around the kitchen together, I thought about the terrified woman who had accepted Diego's offer 6 months ago, who had walked into his world expecting to be devoured, and instead had been cherished. From janitor to wife, from invisible to seen, from drowning to breathing, from surviving to thriving, the transformation was complete, and I would not change a single moment of the journey that had brought us here. The song ended, and Diego dipped me dramatically, making Marco laugh, and when I straightened, I caught our reflection in the kitchen window, a family dancing in warm light, with love written across every face. And I knew that whatever came next, we would face it together, bound by a song and a choice and a love that had been strong enough to transform us both into better versions of ourselves than we could have been alone.